Welcome back to the afternoon, everyone. I'd like to be as interactive as possible, even though it's hard to get me to stop talking. So I will do a lot of talking, but what I would love would be if, as we go along, don't wait till the end, but as we go along, if you have a question, an idea, something you want to bring into the discussion, just come right up. It looks like there's a microphone here so that you can actually be heard by your colleagues. So please don't feel that that would be an intrusion. That would actually be wonderful. Then I would feel like we were actually talking to each other as opposed to me just talking at you. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this intervention that I've shown you a good bit of the psychoeducation, which is really just as simple as understanding how the brain works under stress. But again, if you've ever had a user's guide to your brain under stress before, you're unique. I've never had one. I've never seen one. And most of the people I work, and none of the people I work with have ever had one or seen one. And yet that's exactly what we can share with all of our clients if you want. So again, I do have a commercial interest only because the University of Connecticut up a bit so they could disseminate this intervention because they copy. And so we do trainings all over the country and all over the world, usually for organizations. We're starting now to shift to do trainings for individuals. So if you want, I just told one of other participants, I'm not promoting this at all, but if you want to keep up with information and potentially join us for a training at some point, we'll be doing some online as well. The simple place to go is just advancedtrauma.com. All one. advancedtrauma.com. And we'll do it as low a cost as we possibly can. Okay, so not promoting that, but just in case you want information, or you can Google me, and apparently stuff comes up. I don't know. I don't ever Google myself, so I don't want to know. I don't want to see any of those things. All right, so we've already talked about types of victimization. Well, actually, this is all looking too familiar to me. Wait a minute. I think maybe we've got the keynote on here, and I didn't check it. Nope, this is, All right, well, then I'm just going to go through this because you've seen all of this. And I'm sorry, I don't know why. All right, here's one more thing to tell you about. I'm sorry, but this is a book that I wrote with a minister and personal coach, John Wortman, who his wife was a trainee, a clinical psychology intern working at our clinic, and she learned Target, and she liked it so much she went home and said to him, "You need to use this." And he said, "Oh, I want to learn about this." And he said, "I'm a personal coach, and I'm also, I minister to people spiritually." And he said, "So let's write a book about this." And I thought, oh my gosh, I wouldn't have dreamed of doing that. But he said, "We got to do that." So he's the one with all the great examples. And this is a nice little book that just basically talks about some of these concepts in as down-to-earth language as we possibly could. And some of the clients I've worked with have found it helpful, and if it's of interest to you, please do check it out. Hopefully it's about 99 cents on Amazon at this point. Okay, so we've talked about the brain and stress. Do you have any questions or any thoughts about the SOS and how you would use it? And I'm going to assume that we're going to talk about primarily your work with families, but of course if any of you do individual work or if you do work with groups, feel free to bring up those variations, because we do this intervention in all those formats. We do it in-home family therapy. We've done that with a foster family project, and we're doing it with an adoptive family project, both in the state of Illinois now. We do it with youth, usually pre-adolescents and adolescents, in our juvenile justice and our mental health systems, in groups very often. So we do this over 10 to 12 sessions, and sometimes we're fortunate enough we get the kids to come back for more than one round, and very often they actually like to do that, believe it or not. They like to come back and then be kind of a co-facilitator. And we really do involve them in actually being a peer role model and a peer facilitator, and they are often fantastic at doing that, as you might expect. And we do it on an individual basis. We've done it with moms from inner city Hartford with young children. We didn't do it with their children, but we did it with them to help them do the kind of parenting that you are all helping your clients to do too. So it's actually a fairly versatile approach. As you can see from the psychoeducation, it's just basically explaining something that people need to know about their own brains so that they can visualize what's happening inside their head and it's not a black box anymore. Okay. Any questions or anything you want to raise about the SOS? You know that, forgive me for being didactic, but you know that you will get negative points, you'll get penalty points if you tell anybody that they should only do the SOS or should primarily do it when they're stressed. They can do it when they're stressed. And every time we teach this, when we actually teach this to line staff in programs too. Juvenile detention officers, juvenile probation officers, child protection workers. Sometimes we've even been able to work with law enforcement. We love to do that when we can get a chance. And when we do that, they're often, okay, now I know what I'm going to have this kid do when they start having those reactions or when they start getting stressed out. Well, that's fine, except we don't want to give the message that this is a stress buster. It doesn't necessarily lower a person's stress level. What it does is it helps an individual remember how they focus and be intentional about focusing. Not just focus if you can do it naturally and you're just a really resilient person who just tends to be able to kind of put everything aside and just laser focus in on what needs to be dealt with right now, remembering the larger picture of why you're doing what you're doing and what you believe in, as well as why you're ticked off and why you're frustrated and why you're feeling pressured. So this is really something that's designed to help all of us to remember that at any moment, like even when you're right in the middle of giving a presentation, you could just stop for a moment, and no one necessarily would know unless you self-disclose as I am, and you could just sweep your mind clear, and you could all do that right this moment yourselves. And then you might or might not feel really relaxed, but if you really clear your mind, you won't be able to clear everything away. That's another thing that often comes up. No one can sweep their mind so clear that it's just completely a pristine, clear space, unless perhaps you are an incredibly successful meditator and so mindful that you truly can clear your mind and just be present, completely open to experience in the moment. I've tried that for years, never been able to do it. I can come close once in a while. Usually, as I have learned from my marriage and family therapy spouse, who knows much more about this than I do, usually when I'm in the presence of person or persons where I feel secure and where I feel a sense of trust and comfort. But I can still clear my mind enough to begin to just remember who I am as a person, why I'm doing whatever I'm doing right at this moment, what I want to be able to bring to this moment for myself and for all of us who are participating. And when I do that, usually I feel a little bit clearer about, okay, what could I do right at this moment that might be helpful to this client, this family, this group. So let's see if that's successful. And right now my stress level is about a 7. I don't know, you can check yours, which is not really terrible. When we do this in training or in consultations where we work with agencies or staff groups or clinicians who are implementing the model, we always do the SOS to begin with, of course, just as a kind of an affirmation. And we always check on stress levels. And if somebody says a 7, 8, or 9, nobody yet has done a 10, although kids do 10 all the time. I've had more hundreds, thousands. I'm so far off the chart you can't even imagine it. But if we hear a 7, 8, or 9 from somebody who we're working with or talking with, we'll always say, is there anything that we can do right at this moment to just support you? Not necessarily to make that stress go away, but please let us know. And that's often ended up with some really important conversations in supervision, for example, or consultation, where somebody will say, well, I'm a 7, and the reason is because I just saw this client who I'm really scared I won't see her again next week. Not because she won't show up, but I'm really scared that she's suicidal, and I'm really worried that I didn't do enough, and I don't really know what to do about that, and my supervisor's busy. And then we can have a conversation right at that moment that we would not have had otherwise, very likely. That individual probably would have thought, no, I shouldn't be talking about this. This is a target consultation group, and I shouldn't be bringing in my issues. We need to learn from the great wisdom of the target experts. But no, what's more important is if we can help that individual at this particular moment. That's what brings the model alive. So if you use this, well, okay, I'll let you speak from your chair.
No, they told me they can't always.
All right, you got to come up.
And then there's the Australian accent. So I was thinking about the whole fight, flight, freeze thing that people get into when they're stressed.
The stress response?
Yeah, and Dr. Bruce Perry has added in flock. So I don't know if anyone's heard that, but he talks about the value of being around important people. And just like you mentioned a minute ago, flock, right? And the relationship with your
Birds of a feather,
wife or somebody
Mm-hmm.
supporting. So in step 2, you've got
Yes.
the hope, goal or relationship that you value most in life. And
Yes.
I know that some of the young people I've worked with, if I identify with them something about, even though they don't get on with their mother or their father, they can tell me something nice. So what's the best thing your mother can? She can make the most awesome quiche. And I'm going, you're a boy. Excuse me, why do you like quiche? Because it's a joke in Australia that boys don't like quiche,
Even
right?
boys like quiche.
So
If their mom
anyway,
makes it.
so I said, well, what does that taste like? And you know, can you think about it? When's the last time? And what does it taste like? And he went, oh, it's awesome. You know, I've eaten it in a restaurant. It's terrible, but she... So I was wondering about, in the orienting yourself component, the value of using some sensory processes or some sensory memory to help with the orientation for some of these people, including me, who are a bit hyperactive and therefore find it hard to orient or focus. And so whether that's something that might fit with both the relationship thing and the bits around the relationship, the connecting. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. That's a great point. And see, one of my colleagues, when I was doing a presentation years ago, one of the presenter before me gave a really emotional talk and was also talking about body awareness, which is great. And my colleague said, well, so we just had this talk about living in our bodies, and now Julian, who lives in his head. I said, okay, my alarm went off, going like, I do this too. Excellent point. We don't say that here, but orienting should be all senses. And any sensory avenue that is meaningful to you or a client or whomever you're doing this with. And that's a wonderful example. Sometimes what we remember is we remember this person who's so important to us, who gives us a sense, that inner sense of security and that we're not alone. But the way we remember that person is not necessarily by their name. We remember something about them that oftentimes is the sound of their voice, the smell of something that they cook, dad or mom, or maybe, the smell that goes along with the times where I've spent with my dad, where we're out there working on the car, and this could be a girl or a boy, and I just remember him because of all that oil and grease and stuff. And it was really yucky in some ways, but when I think of it, that just I can see him, and I'm right back there again. So anything that helps a person that you're working with to go right to the memories that are the most kind of enriching, that give them the sense that there is hope, that there's caring, that they have value, that there's people out there who are looking after them and covering their backs and are with them. And all senses are important. So sometimes it's what they've heard. I have a therapist who, when we did the SOS, she said, oh, this is so great because every time I do the orienting, I just go right to that desert island and I'm lying on the beach and the sun's coming down. I can feel the warmth on my body, and there's no pager. Nobody's calling me. I don't have to respond. I'm not on call. But she did a wonderful job of describing how you bring in every possible way to basically what we're talking about is when you bring in the five senses, you're activating the hippocampus. You really are essentially bringing forth memories, and memories are so often stored not as words, but as sounds, sights, feelings, touch, smells. And unfortunately, trauma memories often have those qualities too. And so it's especially useful to help people to be able to purposefully, that's the point of the orienting. It's to purposefully choose. So that's what you don't get to do when you experience trauma. You don't get to choose what happens. It happens to you. It happens at you. You get to choose how you respond in some cases, but even in some cases you don't even get to choose that. You just have to go through it. So the choice to choose what you are going to focus your attention on, and that it's something that has meaning to you, and that says to you, this is who you are as a person, this is what you value, and these are the people who care about you or who you care about, or both. And drawing on any kind of reminders that are possible. One of my colleagues loves to teach about the orienting step by showing a picture of his daughter. And he says, that's my orienting. Okay, so just imagine that. Sometimes it's a four-legged member of your family. They can often be wonderful too because they're non-judgmental for the most part unless they're cats. That's a different kind of judgment. So the orienting then, also know this, that for a long time I made the mistake of assuming that people could just pull these orienting thoughts out of thin air. Well, sometimes people can, but many times none of us can. So it's really useful to not just teach this as something to do, but to spend some time, and in doing this intervention, we'll spend sometimes a whole session just on developing an inventory of orienting thoughts. And we'll do it in pictures, drawings, collage, music, of course, with teenagers or young adults. That's often really important. So developing a menu of orienting thoughts or ways of orienting is just as important as being able to do it in the moment, because then you're primed and ready to go. And you have a menu of possibilities when, in many cases, it's hard to orient when you're really, really upset. But again, the best thing to do here, if it's at all possible, is find your own way. If you think this would be helpful for your clients, for some of your clients, do it yourself first. And do it as a kind of a part of your daily practice, whatever that is. I orient in the morning when I have my swimming suit on. That's part of my orienting time. Sometimes I just don't think about anything, but other times I really do take a few moments while I'm swimming and just think about what's important to me today, right at this moment. And why am I doing what I'm doing? Why am I going where I'm going? What do I want to bring to this experience or share? And that doesn't always work out, but I think it helps me to be more in the moment when I am in that experience or working with that next client. Yes, Susan?
I was just wondering whether when you're upset, isn't the hardest thing just stopping and slowing down?
When you're upset, isn't the hardest thing just to stop and slow down? Often it is. And if you're a teenager, or if you're a developmentally an adolescent like I am, only in the curious sense, yeah, not in the delinquent sense, I hope. Yes, that is often the hardest part. That's why we say with the kids who we work with and their parents often, and ourselves, the toughest thing is to be able to stop and think. And if the kids we work with and the families we work with, if everybody could just stop and think whenever they started to go into alarm mode, we'd be out of business pretty quickly. It wouldn't solve all the problems, of course, but it would be a major, major shift. So finding ways to help the individual, the parent, the dyad, seeing how they do stop, and marking that and helping them see that, see those moments where mom and son or daughter actually pause and just, even for a few seconds or a second, just look at each other, or you see that sense, that kind of synchrony between them, where they may not be pausing behaviorally, but they're connecting. Those are the ways in which we all stop. And again, for a lot of kids, and maybe I should extend that to parents too, because parents often don't have the luxury of stopping. You got to keep going. You got to keep going because there's always one more thing, and unless you have one child, even that one child is probably going to keep you going a lot of the time, but if you got 2 or 3 or more. So stopping sometimes isn't coming to a halt. And that's more like the flight-fight response, which is actually freeze, flight, fight. Sometimes stopping is continuing to move through the experience, but in your mind, just making a little space. So that's why we added the sweep your mind clear, too. Because you may still be moving. I wouldn't want you to do an SOS while you're driving on the freeway. Except if you do it while you're also focusing on what's most important at that moment, which is driving safely. Okay? By the way, that's a great example, too. Driving long distances at high speeds where you're just kind of immersed in the experience. That's one of the best ways I've found of demonstrating what dissociation is. Because we all tend to dissociate at those times where you realize that 5 miles has gone by and you're not sure who was driving. And you think it was you because you're the one sitting there holding the wheel. But you were into that song, or you were into that thought or conversation. Hopefully you weren't on your cell phone. Okay? But that immersion, that's actually the really healthy and really beneficial type of dissociation. That's not the dissociation where you split off because you just can't tolerate what you're thinking or feeling or experiencing. That's the immersion into experience where you lose track of who you are and where you are briefly on some level. Your prefrontal cortex is not completely active because the rest of your brain is doing a perfectly fine job steering. And that's true for parents too, where sometimes they become so immersed in being with their child that time can go by and you don't even realize quite what's happened or how it's all happened. And it's not a blackout. It's actually can be joyful. And that's a wonderful way of actually being oriented. But the idea here is what we do almost instinctively is not as beneficial as when we do it intentionally. So there's always room for doing things in a relaxed way where you don't have to work at it. And believe me, I'm not suggesting that any of us should do this kind of focusing all the time. We need time off. We need to be able to step back and just, be in the moment and not be oriented to anything other than, whatever it is that we're eating or what's on TV or who we're enjoying being with. But when we intentionally choose to go back to what's most important, that's when we're really shifting our brains. And that's what we can help our clients to do too, because that's what we want parents to be able to do, to remember, in spite of all the difficulties, why I'm doing this and why I'm with this child is because this is really so valuable to me. One quick anecdote. I remember in one training I did, it was actually for disaster mental health, but we did a similar kind of an exercise and then suggested that it was a several-day training that everyone go home and find one way to do an SOS. And one of the participants came back the next day and said, wow, that was really great. I've got this teenage daughter who will not speak to me. She thinks I am the most dreaded human being on the planet. She doesn't want to be seen with me. But I go and pick her up every now and I have to pick her up when she stays late from school and can't be on the bus. So I had to go pick her up yesterday afternoon after the training. And I thought, here we go again. I'll pick her up and she'll not even look at me, and I'll try to talk to her and she'll go, no. monosyllabic answers at most, and a kind of a like, oh, I can't stand being with you. So she said, wow, I really knew my alarm was going to get triggered. When my daughter does that, I get so triggered. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, I'll do an SOS. What could I focus on? And she said, it just sort of came to me. I just remembered that beautiful little girl who always was so happy to see me and happy to be with me 10 years ago. And I just focused on that beautiful little girl who's my daughter. And I remembered, she's the same girl who's here right now. And what was different back then? Well, of course, she was younger, and there were a lot of differences for her. But then she said, I started to think about this. What was different for me, too? She said, then I started thinking, what do I do when I'm with my daughter? Well, when she gets in the car, I immediately say, okay, so how did this go? How did your activity go? And she's like, And then I'll say, so are you going to get your homework done? And she'll go, And I'll say something like, you really need to work at this particular project because I know it's due, or, and she said, I realize that I'm constantly on her case. I think I'm being a good parent, and I'm doing what I believe is really good because I feel like she needs a kind of a substitute prefrontal cortex, as all adolescents seem to need at certain times. So I'm trying to be her prefrontal cortex, her thinking center, but I'm driving her crazy. So she said, okay, I reoriented. I just want to be with that 7-year-old who I love so much and who loves me. And so she said, when my daughter got in the car this time, I just said, oh, it's so great to see you. And she said, my daughter looked at me like, what? What do you want from me? What are you doing here? What's coming next? She had a hypervigilant response, which is perfectly understandable, probably very adaptive at that point in time, because under ordinary circumstances, it probably would have been a setup, because Mom probably would have been leading up to something. She said, no, nothing, I'm just really glad to see you. And she said, how about this? I know whenever we're together, I'm always on your case. How about this? I'm just not going to do that at all. And could we just go out and get some pizza together? And her daughter, she said she really got suspicious then. What is this? Uh-oh, this must be leading us. And she said, so her daughter said, oh, well, okay, I guess, even though it's not very, you're always telling me I don't eat healthy, and, so you're gonna make me eat some junk food? Well, okay, I'll do that. So her daughter did the usual, the obligatory kind of, I don't want to do this, but I'll do it if I have to. And she said, but I could see, it's like she was starting to let her guard down just a little bit. And she said, I wasn't playing her. I wasn't trying to manipulate her. I really thought about that, and it was really important. Because if I did this to manipulate her, it would have backfired. It would have just become another kind of a setup. So she said, so I refocused and I said, even though right now she's still being that 15-year-old who I really don't like very much because of how she relates to me, I can see the glimmering, and I remember, so she refocused again. She just didn't do an SOS before. She kept doing it through the whole experience. She said, I kept going back. And she said, as we then ended up having this pizza, we actually started talking about stuff that was important to my daughter and what she was doing in her life and what she enjoyed. And ordinarily, I would have thought, this is fluff, this is not, this is kind of superficial, and I shouldn't be encouraging this because she's talking about going to the mall and all this other stuff that isn't really that helpful. She said, I put that all away, and I just focused on, I really love this girl. She's my daughter. And she said, by the end of the evening, we were laughing. It was almost like back when she was that much younger. And of course, it didn't last exactly that way. But she said, I got a window. I could see how this could be different. And that's what we're hoping for all of our clients. This is not a client, but it was a very similar experience. To just see that window open up where you realize this is the way that this interaction could be if I'm able to focus myself on what's most important. And that, I think, is probably exactly what you're helping moms and dads do with their kids with PCIT. And this is just another way to be very intentional about what you're doing also. And remember that as you do that with them, you are doing the same thing yourself. And if you do it, they will join you. It's kind of like co-regulation, right? If a parent does it, their child will sooner or later will join them. It may take a long time, and it may be very difficult if there's a lot of history, but they will be joined, and there can be some co-regulation, and that is exactly what we're talking about here too. If we do this, we are able to potentially offer co-regulation to our clients, and then they in turn can offer that to their children. So that's the SOS. Now, here's the other part of this model. I purposely wanted to make this intervention as kind of compact as possible. So this could be 15, 20 sessions. It looks like it's a small number of steps, but each one of these could take several sessions, and sometimes it does. We have a shorter version, which I'll tell you about at the end, which is 4 steps, but these are the steps that I've learned from my clients and from reading cognitive neuroscience compulsively for years. This is what we all seem to do when we are able to regain our perspective and reset the alarms in our brain. So it begins with the focusing, but then a really crucial element is to not do the typical, which is to try to avoid or not think about or not talk about what's triggering. You probably have talked about what's triggering with moms and dads and for them with their children a lot. And that's really, really useful. In this case, what's particularly important about identifying triggers is now we're saying, let's look at what turns on the alarm in your brain or your child's brain, okay? So we're not looking for triggers that are like signs of big problems that are going to happen, or when you lose it, okay, or all that bad stuff. This is now reframing the idea of triggers. So now triggers are simply anything that turns on your alarm. And it can be very useful for people to realize that sometimes things that turn on their alarm are things that are happy, that are exciting, that are opportunities. That this alarm that we have in our brain is not just an emergency crisis management kind of machine. It's also a wake up and make the most of this experience opportunity for us in our lives. But triggers usually tend to be what sets off the alarm as a stress reaction. So usually they're challenging, difficult, sometimes very upsetting. And we don't specifically say, let's look at the triggers that come from your trauma. We, however, are always in the back of our mind thinking, which of these triggers for this individual that may seem like a mundane sort of thing, like, for example, going to shop in a busy supermarket. And a lot of times people with pretty significant PTSD or complex PTSD don't want to be around a lot of people, even in very ordinary public settings, and sometimes especially there. And it's not because they don't want to be around anybody, it's because there's too much going on, there's not enough opportunity to know where you are and to make sure that you're safe and that nothing can come at you or no one can come at you. And so very often people will just avoid being in situations that seem completely non-threatening. No conflict, no problems, but they are simply activating that sense of I can't track everything that's happening. Too much information, TMI. That's a really important set of triggers just to be aware of. For parents, they're dealing with so much, so many things as their child develops or children. They've got TMI all the time. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just something to recognize that very often that's not identified as a trigger. And yet that may be why they get really upset with a child or their children. Not because of one thing that the child does, but because there's just been so much going on and they haven't been able to find enough of a separation or quiet to be able to just kind of bring down the activity in their brain where they're just trying to track everything. Triggers, and some triggers are kind of painful reminders too. for a lot of the kids who we work with, and you probably do too, who've been in placements outside of the family, major triggers are things like birthdays, holidays, theoretically happy events, which for them may have been some of the most sad and some of the most discouraging and sometimes terrifying. I have one client who I saw years ago who told me about an incident where he was growing up in a family where the dad was very violent and was just completely out of control. And even before he ended up being in foster placements for years and years, while he was still in his family of origin, he remembered one Thanksgiving where he and his siblings and their mom and dad they were all sitting at the table, and Dad then came in having drank too much, so he's also had some alcohol use problems. So he'd pretty much gotten drunk. He came into the Thanksgiving table and sort of slammed down and said, "What is this?" And I won't repeat all the words that he said, but he said a bunch of things, a bunch of expletives, and then he picked up a knife and he started to slash the turkey, at which point the kids just got up and ran out. And my client says, that was all horrible. That's a really, really bad memory. But the thing that I really remember was as I ran out the door, I remember feeling something go by me. And he said, I looked over the side and it was the knife. And he said, that's the moment that I really remember. So for him, holidays are a very difficult trigger. They represent some of the best things because he's found a way to make holidays a really joyous time in his family, but they also represent not only a sense of just having no family, but literally that sense that I could have been killed in that moment, as ridiculous as that sounds. He also couldn't quite figure out why, when he was in a foster placement where it was one of those really tragic situations that you can't make this up, where the foster parent had a biological son, and the biological son got everything. And he was sort of the Cinderfella guy who got nothing. And so oftentimes the foster parents would take their biological son out and do something really nice and leave him at home alone. And he said, I never knew why, but very often when they did that, first of all, I was actually glad they left, which understandably. And second of all, he said, I don't know why I would do this, but I would just go and get all the steak knives out of the kitchen drawer, and I'd sit down at the kitchen table, and I'd take all these steak knives, and I would put them in a semicircle with the blades pointing at me. And I would just put them like that, and I'd kind of look at that, and then I'd pick them up and take them and put them away again, and I can't figure out why I was doing that. Well, we talked about that for a while, and it really did make sense to him that he was doing that as a way of expressing, this is the situation I'm in. All the knives are pointing at me. It wasn't just from his father, but in so many different ways. And if he could assemble them and be the one who was in control, that felt like that was a little bit better than just having them come flying at him, so to speak. So sometimes our clients come up with these amazing ways of expressing what are the triggers in their lives. And our main point here is that if people are aware of triggers, it not only helps them to anticipate stress reactions, which can sometimes be very helpful, but it also helps them to just recognize that when they have a stress reaction, that simply is their way of recognizing that there's been a time in their life where they just were not safe or where they were not cared for. And that's what this is all about. It doesn't mean that they can't feel happy or they can't feel good or can't have a good life now. But they have to come to that decision themselves. So we work on identifying triggers, and very specific triggers, like in the moment, the look, when my mom gives me that look, when that tone of voice, when the teacher speaks to me in that tone of voice, or my boss, if I'm an adult. So we try to get as specific as possible so that people then are really honing in on exactly what triggers their alarm. And then as it gets triggered, they can say to themselves, well, that makes sense. No wonder I'm having this reaction. That's just the alarm in my brain. And I know what to do about it, because then I have the rest of my steps here. So the next 4 steps I can summarize to you very efficiently, I hope. And they basically are the 4 ways in which our prefrontal cortex, or our thinking center, makes sense of all this information that's coming from the rest of our body and our brain. Of course, we make sense of it in terms of emotions, what we're feeling. We also make sense of it in terms of thoughts or beliefs. And we make sense of it in terms of goals, too. I think sometimes we overlook how important, unless you're really keyed into motivational interviewing or motivational enhancement therapy, it's easy to forget that people don't just have thoughts. They have thoughts that are particularly directed towards what they want to achieve, what they want in life. And we all know that, but sometimes we don't necessarily give enough time and attention to goals, because that's often where people really live. So feelings, thoughts, goals, and then choices. And if you think of it, which behavior, okay? So if you think of it, that's how we all basically operate. We may not be aware, especially if you're a guy like me, you may not be aware of your feelings, but they're there. And if you are aware of them, and I'm just kidding about being a guy, okay, and there's not enough guys here to, come on guys, let's have a little male bonding on this. We don't do feelings, right? Okay, I'm a guy. You remember the old PBS show Red Green, where they had a kind of a lodge group. This is up in Canada. It was very funny. And they had the lodge pledge, which is, I'm a guy, I can change if I have to, I guess. I just modify that to, I'm a guy, I can have feelings if I have to, I guess. Okay, but seriously, in all seriousness, we all start by what we're feeling. And we feel it in our bodies, and as well as sometimes when we know what we're feeling. And then we generate thoughts. And, you know, when you ask clients what are they feeling, very often they'll say, I'm feeling like I don't like this. I'm feeling like I don't want to be here. I'm feeling like I hate this thing. I'm feeling like I'm no good. So very often people immediately go from the feeling right into the thought. And that's fine. We can help them separate those two out. But that just shows that's the logical progression. And then they very often go to, and I don't want to be here, so what do I have to do in order to not have to have any more sessions? Or what do I have to do to graduate? So now they're already talking about their goals. And when you listen carefully to clients, you'll see, of course, and you probably already have, that people go through this progression very naturally, but they don't often systematically think, okay, that was a feeling. I'm feeling frustrated. I'm feeling pressured. I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling happy. I'm feeling whatever. And I'm thinking something that's basically an expression of that feeling. And I have a goal to do something about that feeling. I want more of that feeling. I want less of that feeling. I want to get away from it. And then that's how we make our choices. But if we're not aware of that, what happens, we maintain, and this is what we teach in this intervention, that if your feelings, thoughts, goals, and choices are all dictated by the alarm in your brain, then that's where the title for that little book comes from. You've been hijacked by your brain. I wanted to say hijacked by the alarm in your brain, but the editor said that's too long. So hijacked by your brain, because your alarm is doing the thinking, feeling, choosing for you, setting the goals, making the choices. And none of us want that. It's especially, I think, really useful with teenagers, pre-teenagers, and sometimes with parents, because they don't want to be told what their goals are. They don't want us to tell them. They know what their goals are. But they often have to go for goals that are pro-social and appropriate and demonstrate good parenting and all that kind of stuff, which is nice, but it's a pressure and it's artificial. So what we're suggesting here is, how do you help somebody who is kind of locked into alarm-driven feelings, thoughts, goals, and choices, and you want them to be able to step back? And they can do it a little bit with the SOS, but then they still slip back into those reactive kinds of patterns and doing the things that really are not helpful with their child, with their own life. our suggestion is you help them to articulate very clearly what is it that your alarm is telling you. So we spend a lot of time focusing on what are your alarm emotions, what are your alarm thoughts, what are your alarm goals, and what are your alarm choices. And when we do this with teenagers, we don't encourage them to come up with really horrendous goals or choices, like, I want to blow up the school. But we do give them space to say, if one of your possible options is to beat the hell out of this other kid who's making you so upset, that is an option. We don't endorse it. We don't say that, go right ahead and do it, because if that's what you want to do, go ahead and do it. We don't give them a big lecture about, well, now, what's going to happen if you do that? But we do introduce that's one option. That has some benefits, but it also has some pretty serious costs, okay? And now let's look at this same chain a little differently. Once we've looked at what your alarm is telling you, what is your thinking center and your memory filing center? What are they telling you? And they're telling you based on what's really important to you. That's why we do the orienting step. So we go back and we walk through the feelings that you have when you are at your best, when you are able to be the person who you truly are, when you're with the people who you care about. And again, sometimes this is very difficult if a client is in very difficult circumstances. It may be hard for them to even think about, let alone to actually experience vicariously a sense of safety, trust, caring, if that's really in short supply in their life or unpredictable. But everybody has those experiences. And what we do is we work with our clients to find times where they felt safest, most cared about, strongest, most successful, and we listen carefully as they talk about what they're good at. So I'll give you one example here. A young man who came into our trauma clinic, and the first words out of his mouth were, "I know you want to talk about goals, Doc." Because every therapist I've been to, he'd been to like 5 or 6 therapists. He'd been through the ringer. Every therapist I go to wants to talk about goals. I don't have goals. I don't do goals. Are we done? And I said, well, we could be done, and yes, goals could be something we could talk about, but if you don't do them, let's figure out, what's important to you in your life. And he goes, oh, well, you wouldn't want to know that. You either wouldn't want to care, or there's not anything I can tell you about. So I said, well, let's give me a little time. Let's just try this out. And we spent a number of sessions where basically he was on his cell phone texting, and I was sort of like furniture. And occasionally we would have a little bit of conversation about, so who you talking to, and what's up with that relationship, as I'm trying to do my subtle assessment. The only thing I could possibly do other than saying, would you put that cell phone away and talk to me, which of course that was my alarm choice and goal. An option, but I chose not to do that because I thought, what's really important here is this kid has not had much space in his life. And I did learn over time, he kind of let drip a little bit. The foster parents he had been with, who he had trusted and then had split up. He was doing marriage therapy with one pair of foster parents even today. He would get them on the phone and get them talking to each other. He told me all about that. So here's a kid who basically, he knew enough to not let himself be vulnerable to trust. And it wasn't because he's a really angry, distrustful kid. He just knew that you get hurt if you trust people. Because he was actually... He was a kid who everybody thought, oh, he doesn't get along with anybody. He was as relational as any of the clients I've ever seen. He was completely relationally oriented, but he had been burned so many times. And it wasn't abuse or neglect. It was just simply losses, transitions, people not being able to help him by staying with him because of their own lives. He had also had traumas as well. So here's then what we ended up doing. Here's how he did tell me about what he's really good at and how he makes choices. he came into a session with his cell phone on and said, "You got to see this movie, this film I made. You got to see this." I'm thinking, oh, good, this is great. He wants to show me something. He said, "I got this film of these two girls, and they are beating the hell out of each other." And I said, uh-oh, internally I had a major alarm reaction again. I can't watch this. I can't encourage this. Of course not. But on the other hand, I don't want to just shut him down and be like every other adult and say, that's not appropriate and this is very bad. So I said, okay. I did my SOS and I said, okay, what's important here is I'm going to negotiate. So I said, I will watch this film, but I'm going to watch it to see your camera technique. I'm not going to pay attention to what those girls are doing to each other because I don't feel good about that. That's not something that I really believe in. If that's something you choose to film, then that's your choice. But I'm interested in how you got the film and how you did this film. And it turns out that he was quite a brilliant videographer because he got in and around that fight. He was like underneath, and he got different angles, and he got right in the middle between them. And I said, "How did you do that?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, everybody knows. They just leave me alone. I don't get anybody's way, and I'm sort of like a ghost. I can just go anywhere." Okay, yeah, that fits. Now I know him a lot better. And then after the film, he did a post-fight interview with each of the combatants. He went and he actually interviewed, "So, what do you think? She really wailed the hell out of you, didn't she? But you got her pretty good." So, and I said, at the end of that, I said, I really, I know that I'm not supposed to in any way condone this, and I don't condone fighting, and I don't like to see when kids are hurting each other, and I don't think it's a really great idea to make that something that we celebrate. But I'm really impressed with your camera technique and your interview technique. Have you ever thought about becoming a foreign war correspondent? Because you really could have a career. And he's like rolling his eyes. "What are you talking about, Doc? That's crazy." But I could see, it's like he thought, this guy, this doctor, he's nuts. But he actually sees that I'm good at this. And he actually sees that this could lead somewhere in my life. And to me, that's what we're really talking about here. We're helping our clients to see that in the midst of their stress reactions, they have the ability to feel in ways that are really very healthy, to think in ways that are very smart, even though they often don't get credit for that, to choose goals that actually could be meaningful and productive and pro-social without us forcing that. And when they do, they are actually able to free themselves from the tyranny of their alarm. And that's really the crucial thing here. Saying we don't want to get rid of the alarm. Yes, sometimes we wish we could all just completely shut it out or take a medication that would just get rid of the alarm or turn it down. But the alarm is telling us what we need to know to be safe. And the rest of our brain is telling us what we need to know in order to have a life. And if we could just put those two together, that's where we begin to have more balance in our lives. And that's what this intervention basically walks people through. How do you put that together so that at every moment when you're stressed, you remember to focus on your alarm reactions, but you also remember to focus on what's truly important to you. So you see, it's really just the orienting step played out through each of these different aspects of our way of processing information or being in the world. And then the last point, because I think our time is about up, is that we think, I've learned that it's really important to help people who have experienced trauma to recognize that they are really valuable. They're not just people who need to recover. They're people who bring a lot to the world. And they don't have to do community service to do that. They don't have to try to be a nice person or a good person or a success. What they do is every time that they are able to reset the alarm in their brain and handle the situation thoughtfully, where maybe everybody else, including the adults, if this is an adult, including the professionals, if this is a parent, everybody else is in alarm mode, and they're the one person in the group that's actually able to think clearly and have some personal control. Every time they do that, they're doing something that's an incredible contribution. And that's what they do every time that they help their child to move through a stress response or a time in which their alarm is going off. And as they do that, that's the contribution. That's what makes a difference in the world, not just to their child, but to their spouse, to their friends, their family. And when people think about that, then I think that very often they recognize that, there's a reason why I'm still alive. I make a difference. And it's not because of big, lofty ambitions or achievements. It's because sometimes I'm the one adult in the room who isn't just a walking, talking alarm. And to me, that's the wonderful part of doing this work. I suspect that's exactly what you're doing. I hope this gives you just another framework for thinking about the work you're doing. And if you'd like to learn more about this particular intervention, then I'd be glad to share that, but I hope this gives you a little bit of a sample. Any questions or comments before we break? Oh, there, I knew I was going to take up the whole time. Okay, everybody wake up. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Sharon Raizone from the UC Davis Care Center in our Infant Mental Health Program, and I have the honor of introducing you to two of my colleagues, Kate Kaltenbach and Elizabeth, or Liz, Mota-Garcia. All three of us are licensed clinical social workers working in the realm of providing services for birth to 5. Today we want to talk with you a little bit about Touchpoints and how to use Touchpoints when you're thinking about coaching with parents and children who are involved in PCAT services, Parent-Child Attunement Services. And just like Dr. Ford just spoke with us a lot about orienting ourselves to what's going on for a parent, a child, I always like to talk about one of my favorite subjects is infants and toddlers and preschoolers, but I always like to orient by thinking about, in our minds, a special child, a child in birth to 5 or who was birth to 5, or if you don't have one of those in your life, when you were birth to 5, and a special memory about them to kind of call them into the room. You'll see a lot of pictures of cute kiddos because, again, that's a way that orients us to that work. So in addition, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about how to weave some of the touch points into coaching specifically for birth to 5. So when we think about, first of all, what are touch points, one is it's something that it's actually a way of being with parents and children, supporting parents in the very important role of helping their child's healthy development. It's created by T. Barry Brazelton and his colleagues, and he has worked from this framework for a very long period of time. He's currently 99 years old, and he's been doing this for just about ever. So anyway, he informs the touch points ideas that we're going to share today. So the thing about touch points is that there are some parent assumptions and some parent principles that I'm going to share with you in a few moments. But the assumptions are first that when a child is born, a parent has 2 questions. Is my baby all right? And am I a good enough parent? And we want to think about that framework because it helps inform the passion that a parent has for a child. We don't always see that passion in the way that we would like to when kids come to see us at the clinic or in home, but it's there, and we want to be able to fan the sparks that are still there and burn that in or bring that into a brilliant bonfire for this relationship. So again, the idea that all parents want the best for their child. and that the parents are the experts on their child, not us as the providers. Yes, we know some things based on our knowledge, our experiences, and our skills, but we want to really support parents in knowing that they too are really knowledgeable about what their child is doing, and we can help them develop some new skills. So the other thing about Touchpoints is, as we all know from our child development classes, there are a lot of milestones along the way of development. Touchpoints are like those milestones, and they're really important to look at because they develop a bit of a map, not a bit, a really nice map for us to think about when we're trying to help parents understand their child's behavior and anticipate some of the changes that are coming. I don't know, how many of you use Waze or some sort of map thing to get like here or anywhere? Yeah. And so if you think of it as a map, one of the things you notice on the map is that you can see where you're supposed to go, and you know that sometimes you're going to make some changes and not always stay on the path. And like with Waze, I know that it'll show me where those red or green or yellow sections are when the traffic is slowing down, and where there's potential bumps in the road or blockages to get me where I want to go. So in a way, Touchpoints are like that because they do help inform what's coming, and it helps people, I think, parents hang in there that, okay, my child is not abnormal. I'm not a terrible parent. I just have to work through this. So as I mentioned, it takes place in terms of relationships. And then also the other thing to remember is that as children develop, there's a period of disorganization prior to each developmental spurt. And that period of disorganization is really a challenge for parents, for providers, for childcare providers and preschooler teachers. So we want to keep that in mind. And we also want to keep in mind that the emotions of both the parent and the child are really central to this whole process. Again, we want to, similar to what the SOS model that Dr. Ford was just talking about, we build the relationship with the parent so that the parent can build the relationship with their child or with the provider. So as I mentioned, there's those predictable bumps in the road. And I wanted to share a few of the touch points that kind of informs our work. And I'm going to see if I can manage this great green pointer here. But this is just a map of typical development. It's not a smooth path. It goes a little rocky. And then there's this dip that goes down, and that's when that chaos and disorganization is happening and throws everything out of whack. I can recall as a parent thinking, oh my gosh, I just learned how to get this routine down. I just learned how to deal with my child in this way. And then they changed it all up on me. Well, that's what happens. It's supposed to happen. So it's a good thing that it does. So some of the touch points that are predictable and ones we think about, especially when we're doing PCAT, are about 9 months of age, for example. The pincher grasp starts. And so a child has much more mobility in their hands. They can pick up things, put them in their mouth, of course, explore them, but it creates a sense of danger. And they're much more mobile at that point. Usually children at that age are toddling around, crawling around. Some of them are beginning to pull up, etc. So they're grabbing these things with these much finer skills and also getting more mobile. Creates a lot of stress for a parent who is very used to their child being in the same place that they put them when they left the room. Yeah. The other thing for 12 months is another touch point, excuse me. And one of those points, and actually between 9 and 12 months, is usually when a child will start working on those skills of standing up. So you'll see them practicing by pulling up on the edge of the couch, pulling up on the edge of their crib, and this can even occur in the middle of the night. So during those natural sleep-wake cycles, all of a sudden they get this idea that, okay, now it's time to practice. Well, it's great, but if there's supposed to be sleep time, it's really hard as a parent to appreciate your child's, exercise routine. So at that point, it's how do you predict that this is going to happen so that you can deal with it? 15 months is another touch point, where, and there's 13 touch points in all. They start prenatally and go through year 3, I believe. And, but at 15 months, again, things are changing. One of the things I didn't mention back at the 9-month-old, it's usually when separation anxiety starts to appear. And it's a time when a child realizes person permanence, like object permanence happens a little bit earlier, person permanence happens. And what happens then is they realize that, oh, this person can disappear just as much as they can come back. And if I call them back with my cry, that's pretty powerful. So it becomes a challenge for a parent, and when they say, I can't even go to the restroom without my child calling for me. Well, they're practicing a very important developmental skill. But as I mentioned, separation anxiety, so that person permanence is the beginning of that. And then at 15 months, they're experiencing that idea of greater mobility. What happens when mom or dad isn't there? They need them for that sense of security and safety. And so that can create some tensions as well. A lot of times, too, children will develop an ability because of greater capacity for intellectual capacity as well as mobility, but they'll start to use this function of kind of teasing a parent. Like you'll see them try and tease, and then they'll, because they know that they can get some sort of a reaction. Usually it's based on some experience, but they try things out too. And so what kind of reaction the child gets is very important to understanding whether it's okay, not okay, somebody enjoys me, somebody doesn't enjoy me. So all of that is just to be aware of. And then again, at 18 months is another very important touch point when a child has an even greater ability to think, to feel, and to move. And this is usually a time when that emerging independence is coming online, and we very often know these as the approaching terrible twos, because a child will start to say, hey, I not only know what I want to do, but I want to do it now. So control battles can become a very big thing. So it's a time, again, when we want to look at helping a parent anticipate these and think through them beforehand in such a way to help them develop their own tool belt or their filing cabinet, fill up their filing cabinet, if we think of Dr. Ford's analogy this morning. So knowledge of the touch points, as I just mentioned, can help them fill up their filing cabinet and not only help with development, but also help with reducing abusive or harsh or unintended consequences in terms of how a parent's determining how they don't want to discipline or limit their child. Okay. And these are some of the guiding principles, and the ones that we're going to be talking about in relationship with the PCAT is looking at valuing and understanding the relationship, using the child's behavior, focusing on the parent-child relationship, and supporting mastery. So I want to turn it over to Kate now.
So the nice thing is that Touchpoints and PCAT or PCIT blend together really nicely. So as clinicians, we're already doing a lot of these things. So when we think about assessment with our families, we're asking questions about daily routines. We're asking about sleeping and feeding patterns and developmental milestones that the child has met, and finding out from the parent or caregiver what it is that they want to see as sort of this positive outcome for treatment. So we're already really sort of using this as a framework, I think, but my hope from our talk today is that we can just think together about more strategies that we can use as therapists to really incorporate this framework into our practice. And so just to give an overview of parent-child attunement therapy, most of us are probably familiar with it being just a modification to PCIT to really focus on younger children. And so the overall purposes of PCAT are really to strengthen the caregiver-child relationship and just to increase the overall well-being of the child in the context of their social environment and caregiving relationships. And then really providing caregivers with that toolbox of strategies to help manage some of the problem behaviors that come up throughout the course of development. And I also want to just highlight, how important these early interventions are with families, because as we know, 0 to 3 is, the most critical period of brain development. And the work that we do with families is really focusing on increasing the quantity and the quality of those positive interactions so that children have healthy brain development and healthy interpersonal relationships as they move on in life. And just thinking too about, infants and toddlers being in an age that are at increased risk for maltreatment, and thinking about some of these, touch points that can be really stressful for parents, trying to navigate toileting and diapering and their child saying no and mine. Really place children at increased risk for maltreatment when parents are feeling really overwhelmed and have high stress and don't know how to manage those different things that come up. So PCAT is a really important intervention for us to be able to intervene at the right moment.
So just to set it up, we all know how we set up our offices and or if we do therapy in the home, setting up and picking the appropriate toys for the kids. So we want to pay attention to developmentally appropriate toys. So making sure that we have larger toys specifically for the kids. We don't want any choking hazards. And looking at some of the toys that are fun. Little kids tend to have a harder time really focusing or engaging in play. Sometimes they're more active, as we know, in their development. They want to move around. They want to jump. They want to climb. So picking toys that would be more appropriate to enhance that. So they love the little animals. So we get some soft ones. So typically PCIT, we might get the farm, house, and harder toys. Bigger toys, they like to throw things also. So for that reason, softer toys might help them and help us or anyone else around. The blocks, little kids, we know they like stacking. And it's part of their development, also modeling. So when we're coaching parents to model, to teach kids, a lot of the times we might stack a block and show the child how to stack also. And we'll get more into coaching like that. Other little toys that we might not think of that are PCIT, but we modify some of those toys. So even a small ball, they like that interaction face-to-face, making a connection. So rolling the ball to the baby, to the toddler, rolling it back, putting things in objects. Sometimes even just a bag, right? For Christmas, a lot of the kids, they get a nice present in a bag and they end up playing with the bag instead of the toy. So sometimes using the little bags that are appropriate with supervision to put things in. So one of the toys there with the blocks where you put things in, that one there. When you put things in, kids will like that even if they're not sure how to put it in. And that you would really involve yourself with the child. So using the touch points of connection, attachment, holding your child, the parent, they will be able to put toys in. So setting up the environment, we want to make sure that the environment is compliance friendly. So even though that looks like a lovely place to play, it's very organized and very colorful and pretty. It's too much for a young child. It's too much stimulus. So we want to pay attention and look at how do we set up the rooms? How do we organize the toys? What do we set out? So we want to look at a more smaller space, possibly. We want to look at boxes of small toys or toys in a small box. And we want to really condense it, not give too much to go around. And play might not even be on the table as you see there. A lot of the little kids prefer to go and play on the floor, so following the child as the parent would. Follow the child to meet them where they are and go onto the floor. So what does play look like? On the floor, typically. And this is a perfect example of using descriptions. And it helps with the development, but we're also looking at playing on the floor, following the child's lead, and in this specific situation, describing the child's behaviors would be an appropriate coaching strategy. You can tell the parent is paying attention to the child, is looking at the child, following the child's lead. Typically, parents, we find that they want to teach their child in this stage because they don't know how to play with toys, they don't know what to do with them, and they're trying to teach them what to do, how to do this, how to put that in there. But if you just follow the child's lead and we coach the parents to follow the child leads, it helps them develop more appropriately. This is one of my favorite ones, so using hand over hand with a lot of children. So sitting with the child, you see the closeness, you have that piece where the child and the parent really connect. You're using touch as a form of connecting with the child and letting them know that you're there to support, or the parent is there to support. So coaching parent to hold the child, use the hand to teach them and model the behaviors or the play. This is imitating, or an example of imitating that we can coach parents to really imitate the child, also to follow the child's lead. Let the child know that you approve of the behaviors, that the parent approves of the behaviors that they're doing, really develops them. And it gives them this sense of success, right? So we want the parent to be a person that really helps the child feel like they're successful. And kids really like that, young children like to feel that they're successful at completing tasks. When it pretend play, so the children are developing also, so you want to pretend with, the parent wants to pretend with them, follow their lead. A lot of it would be functional play, pretend play, depending on the age of the child and what stage in development they are, using their imagination. And I like this one a lot, the connection that the parent and the child have, looking at each other, clapping, more than just to praise a good job, but there's a clapping that really shows the enthusiasm the parent has for the child, and the behaviors really helps them to develop further. With younger children, holding them, the smiling, the connecting with each other really supports also coaching that. It helps the child, as we know, feel supported, feel that the parent is there when they need them. And sometimes we get a lot of siblings in sessions, especially when the holidays and school's out, there's no other way the parent and the child is there. So how do we engage the sibling in the session also, if it has to, and the parent, coaching the parent to attend to both children, give attention to both equally, and support also. So some of the coaching strategies that I might use is having the older sibling model some of the behaviors. So if the older sibling is doing a positive behavior, letting the other younger children, or praising that child, and the younger one might also do that. They would do a lot of imitating of their older sibling, or the other way around. And then using the environment. So a lot of kids the younger kids are not always as interested in the toys. So using the environment that you have around you, kids might not always need toys. The parent can connect with the child simply by playing peekaboo, by clapping. A lot of the holding and touching, it's a big part in the younger children play.
So Liz talked a lot about the different ways to bring play into the interaction between the parent and child. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the more common behavior problems that come up for this age group. And we actually have a handout in the back that you can pick up on your way out that gives some different examples and strategies to use. And so just thinking about behaviors that might come up and talking with the parents about possible reasons and the developmental meaning behind those behaviors. So to really normalize it for the parent so they can understand, okay, this is a normal part of my child's development. And really finding out, where and when that behavior is happening, so that we're able to problem solve with the parent about how to manage it. And just making sure that the parents have a great toolbox of strategies to be able to use for specific incidents that come up. Because not every strategy is going to work every time, so that they can really be able to have something that's really accessible. So I'm just going to talk about a few of some of the more common things that come up. So thinking about a young child and sleep issues. So, hearing parents talk about different complaints, like it takes forever for my child to fall asleep, or my child wakes throughout the night. So really finding out, what that looks like. So asking questions about the bedtime routine and finding out, is the TV on the entire night? Is the child sleeping on the couch with the TV on? Are they getting a lot of sensory input from television or other sort of overstimulating activities right before bedtime? So always sort of asking those questions. And sometimes we have a better idea if we go in home for services, but in the clinic, just making sure that we gather that information. And other, sleep issues that might come up are things like separation anxiety. So finding out, is this typical of how your child reacts every time you leave? Does it only happen around bedtime? Finding out more about that. And then also knowing when there might be sleep issues that aren't explained by any of those things. So maybe the child needs to be referred back to their medical doctor to look at things like sleep apnea or seizure activity. So those things can be common in young children as well. So when we think about solutions for some of those issues, really helping the parent think about how do I establish this consistent, predictable routine for my child so that bedtime routines are easier to manage. And helping them think about, if their child does have a lot of emotional distress or separation anxiety from the parent, helping them continuously establish really predictable, sensitive responses for their child to hear. So the same thing they would say as they're, dropping off at school is similar to what they'll say at bed, you're safe, I'm right here, I'll be back, things like that. So how important those consistent routines are for children. And then thinking about mealtime situations. So I think a lot of things come up for parents during this time, and just helping them to think about how to manage different things. So it might be a matter of, being able to better read the child's cues. Are they getting up and wandering around because they're done with food, or is there just too much going on in the environment? So a lot of times thinking about, does there need to be a change in the environment, like the TV off and sitting at the table, or does the child need some established rules? For example, if the child has a really difficult time getting up and wandering around, making a rule that we sit at the table for 5 minutes, and if you sit for 5 minutes, then you get to do this, and if not, then you lose this. Or making a rule for something like a no thank you bite. So if a child doesn't want to try things on their plate, at least having them take a bite and then say no thank you if they don't want it. I think that can be a really common issue that comes up, is parents complaining about their children not eating enough or not eating enough healthy foods. And so really just working with them to make some of these strategies that we use all the time really fit with the unique situation of each family. And then also always thinking about, the developmental meaning. So, one of the things that children are exploring when they're still in high chairs is the cause and effect of dropping food on the floor and making a mess. And so really just knowing that that's the child exploring their environment and what happens when they interact with it. And so helping the parent figure out ways to manage that. So, maybe it's redirecting them to another activity that's similar, where they get to drop pom-pom balls off their high chair, or things like that. So always just supporting whatever the parent really values as an important touch point, and how to help them manage that. And then just lastly, to talk a little bit about disobedience and defiance. So parents really struggling with the terrible twos, or the no, mine, and the constant sort of power struggle that can come from that. And so I think a lot about, some of the touch points of diapering and toileting, and how those can really cause some pretty big challenges for parents. But how do we support the parent and the child and their autonomy around that? So helping parents to consistently use 2 choices when it's available. So, you can have a diaper change now or in 5 minutes, or you can have a stand-up diaper or a laying down diaper. So giving them choices whenever they can have it will really reduce those power struggles and reduce the amount of negative interactions that are happening, so that children are not at increased risk for abuse in those more challenging situations. And that's it. Do you guys have any questions for us?
Yes, I have a good time. I don't want to stop at all. Yeah, I'm a rocket ship on my way to Mars on a collision course. I am a satellite. I'm out of control. I'm a sex machine ready to